Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whichever time zone you're in, and welcome to this session. My name is Salim Haq. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and it's my pleasure to be your host for this session. I'm going to start by giving a little bit of a background of what this conference is about, and then I'll introduce the speaker for this particular session. It's one of our series of keynote speeches by eminent international experts. So the word Gobeshona, which is the name of this conference, is a Bangla word for research. And it's a word we adopted for setting up a platform of research institutions and universities in Bangladesh 7 years ago. It's now has more than 50 institutions, research institutes, universities, and NGOs and others working on climate change in Bangladesh. And for the last 6 years, we used to have a big annual conference every January, where we got several hundred people, mostly from Bangladesh, but also a significant number of international participants. They would come to Dhaka for 4 days, and we hosted them in a traditional in-person conference format at our university, the Independent University Bangladesh. This year, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the inability of people to travel, we have made it an online conference. But by virtue of it being an online conference, we have reached out to friends across the world to make it into a global conference and not just focused on Bangladesh anymore. And I must say that we had an overwhelming response from friends around the world to offer to take sessions. The theme, by the way, of the overall conference is on locally led adaptation, working with the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries, which is what we have specialized in doing. But now we're reaching across the globe to vulnerable communities around the world. And there are vulnerable communities around the world. In fact, yesterday I had a very good session at this time with the resilience officer of Rhode Island state, talking about vulnerable communities in Rhode Island in the United States. And there's interesting similarities of how to deal with the problems, if not exactly the same problems. So these local adaptations are taking place all over the world, and we're trying to connect them. So we ended up with about 90 sessions, and we're running them 24/7 over 7 days. So 24 hours over 7 days. Today is the 6th day. Tomorrow we have one more day to go. The last 5 days went very well. We're doing them in 8-hour segments. The first 8 hours for the Asia Pacific zone, then another 8 hours for Africa and Europe time zone, and then another 8 hour for the Americas, North and South America. And the South American friends who've done sessions, they do them in Spanish as well. So it's gone very well. We've been amazed by the enthusiasm by which people have offered to do sessions and the participation that we've had, which has been amazing. So we've decided to keep this format going in the future. We will continue to keep this an online conference in coming years every January, and we will keep the theme of globally led adaptation, trying to globally link local adaptation communities doing adaptation on the ground and sharing their knowledge with each other and their experiences with each other going forward. So as part of these series of sessions we've had thematic sessions, we've had organizational sessions, and we've had a series of keynote speeches by eminent experts, as I said. And tonight, this session is one of the keynote speeches, and I'm very pleased to have with us Jennifer Morgan, who is the head of Greenpeace International. Jennifer is a very old friend. We have been in the trenches in the conferences of parties every year in the COP, pushing for ambition from the developed countries and some big developing countries as well. We go back a long way. So Jennifer, thank you very much for being with us. Once you've given your presentation, I'll have a conversation with you. And if there are any other questions from the audience, we can take maybe one or two. But please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Salim. And good day to all of you listening today. It's just a real honor to be here. Someday, when you do it in person again, I look forward to sitting next to you, Salim. but I'm just really impressed, and I appreciate the opportunity to reach out to everybody. And what a fantastic format to have so many people be included. And I love the Spanish-speaking sessions. I just think it really makes it much more possible to have so many more people engage, and also able to do it in their own time zone and their own mother tongue without jet lag and everything else. So well done to the organizing team. We're at this amazing, incredibly challenging moment in history right now. As we know, we have multiple unfolding crises that pose very tangible threats to human and planetary survival. And we have an acute health crisis, a chronic environmental crisis, and a social justice crisis. And all of these have huge magnitude that touches on everybody's lives. And so I think it's at these times that we really have to step up to our collective responsibility to support those who are most at risk, which, as we all know, are most often the poorest and the least responsible around the world. And we also have to understand, I think, that in recovering from crises, we also have the occasion to design and develop solutions that are sustainable and that really end the threat and promote a fairer, safer, greener, and more peaceful future for all. And I really believe that this is such a time, because we've seen just a huge light shone in on the inequalities around the world through the COVID pandemic. So it's a time to transform the world around us. It's a time to really look beyond symptoms and address root causes. It's a time that we have to we understand we can change broken systems and not just fix them or reform them, but really replace them. And obviously that transformation, and we all know the emission reduction goals, not just goals, but implementation that are required to meet the Paris goal on 1.5. And the halving of emissions, at least in this next decade and then the decade after. And also, as you all know, and I know there's eminent experts here on adaptation and resilience, this transformation also has to include that massive building up resilience of societies, of economies, of nature, of the entire system. And we have to pursue these hand in hand together. But we know that, the climate emergency is here and now. So we have to massively accelerate the pace and speed of change. So today, really, I wanted to share with you one idea on how to go about doing that, drawing from experiences of the Greenpeace network and our allies around the world. And that's around strategic litigation. So in 2009, we started looking at this to assert the fundamental rights of those most impacted by the climate crisis, to address the multiple social, political, and environmental layers of the problem in a cohesive way, and human rights that would help us address the source of the threats and not only their outcomes. And so in thinking this through, we identified three fundamental premises for our work, which sound very obvious, but I think it's important to kind of put them out there. So first is that people have rights, that every single one of us has a right to a healthy environment and a safe climate. Second is that states have duties. Governments have legal obligations to act in a manner that protects people from the impacts of climate change. Governments do not have unlimited discretion. They have to take ambitious actions to address the climate emergency and other crises like COVID-19 to protect human rights in the process and to preserve institutions for the people. And third is that businesses have responsibilities. So for example, fossil fuel companies and their financial backers have legal responsibilities to prevent, mitigate, and remedy the adverse climate-related human rights impacts that are linked to their operations, their products, or their services. So in doing this, obviously the science is fundamentally important for this work, and it's really continued to evolve over the years. And I thought it would be helpful before maybe going into some examples of the litigation is just to review that a little bit, because it's the foundation of it all. And I think it's determinative in shaping a strategy in two crucial issues in climate liability. The first is, to what extent are the greenhouse gas emissions causing anthropogenic climate change the defendant's responsibility, whether it's a corporate or a government? And the second is to what extent the specific injuries or the harms suffered by individual plaintiffs are attributable to the defendant's contribution to climate change. So in science terms, the first concept refers to source attribution, which is a science that looks at the attribution of climate change to specific sources. And the second concept refers to impact attribution, which is the science that looks at the attribution of particular impacts to anthropogenic climate change. And in the early days of strategic climate litigation, I mean, I remember, Salim, I'm sure you were part of this as well, back when I was at WWF in like 1999 or something like that. You know, it just was at a different stage. Corporations argued that the contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is insignificant in relation to historical or global emissions, and therefore they can't be said to directly cause climate change harms. And I think the fact that climate change has such transboundary character really renders it difficult to attribute liability for climate change to particular actors. Courts were reluctant then to make definitive findings about climate change causation. They tended to regard climate change as a consequence of collective policies rather than specific emissions from major climate polluters. And for that reason, climate change challenges were treated as more political questions that were generally deemed unsuitable for judges to decide. However, you know, there's been advances in climate science that have enabled researchers to identify discrete groups of potential defendants whose contributions to the climate crisis are identifiable, measurable, and significant. And a key one was in 2013. There was groundbreaking research by Richard Head, where he attributed historical CO2 emissions to the world's largest carbon producers. Head's research showed that 90 carbon producers were responsible for almost 2/3 of all anthropogenic CO2 between 1751 and 2013. So looking at major investor-owned companies, that amounts to 47 actors, which we now call the climate majors. And they had contributed to 21% of global emissions. But Head continues to update that research, and he's confirmed that just a few dozen entities, really, which include coal, oil, and gas companies, they are responsible for the climate pollution driving the impacts we're experiencing today and will continue to experience well into the future. So after the publication of this research, the question then remained, well, how much is the rise of global surface temperature, sea levels, more ocean acidification due to each specific company's products' emissions? And so building on that climate major research, 2 studies led by the Union of Concerned Scientists found that carbon and methane emissions traced to the 90 carbon producers contributed, quote, nearly 50% of the rise in global average temperature and around 30% of sea level rise since 1880. So emissions traced to 48 major investor-owned fossil fuel producers contributed about 17% of the rise in ocean acidification and about 17% of global average surface temperature increase and around 13% of sea level rise from 1880 to 2015. So I think the critical findings of these studies really showed people around the world that the roots of the problem are more recent and they're easier to trace than previously assumed. And I think many really refer and see Head's study as a turning point in the debate about apportioning responsibility for climate change. And it was the first study that helped identify a concrete class of private defendants in climate litigation. And it removed previously insurmountable hurdle for grassroots seeking to hold major emitters accountable. There's also been other developments. Obviously, there's extensive research into fossil fuel industry's awareness and knowledge of and action on climate change that helps to further establish corporate responsibility of the climate crisis, and lots of good work happening. NGOs such as Climate Investigation Center and the Center for International Environmental Law and journalists have revealed that the fossil fuel industry had early knowledge of climate risks and opportunities to act on those risks, but they repeatedly failed to do so. You can go back and look, even in the 1950s and the 1960s, some members of the fossil fuel industry were actively engaging in climate science and they had actual knowledge of the grave dangers that were posed. And by the 80s, it's pretty clear the fossil industry knew that there was a broad scientific consensus that climate change was real. And then into the 90s, following the establishment of the IPCC and the start of the global negotiations, They ran full-blown campaigns, the fossil fuel industry did, that manufactured a lot of doubt. In 1998, there were members of the industry association, the American Petroleum Institute, American Petroleum Association. They had a communications plan about this, but it wasn't any, it wasn't a comms plan. It was a strategy to confuse the public about climate change. So building around a narrative around that uncertainty was the industry's weapon to delay action. And the delay, as we know, has caused real damage. And so I think that's a bit of the science piece. I mean, I think there's now ample evidence that some companies continue even to demonstrate intent to put profit over people and the planet. Just recently, we saw a study by Influence Map that ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron, BP, and Total have invested over $1 billion of shareholder funds in 3 years following the Paris Agreement on misleading climate-related branding and lobbying. So it's not over, right? It's they may be saying nice things, but they're doing something else. But how does this actually translate? So I think the science I just wanted to cover because I think it's important. That's the key piece of it. But I wanted to just share a couple of stories with you of examples. One is from the Philippines. So in November 2013, we can all remember Typhoon Haiyan, which was one of the most powerful storms of all time. It tore through the central region of the Philippines. It devastated the land. It killed thousands and affected millions. And in the wake, people were asking, well, what made this so deadly? And what can we do to deal with increasing strong storms? And those questions came from people who lived and had been impacted. So a young woman named Joanna Sesteno, she lost her parents. She lost her eldest brother, her sister-in-law, and their 3-year-old son in the floods. There were other people there, Amalia Bajan and Hanalyn Gonzalez, who also lost children and parents, and for whom the typhoon just has continued to steal their peace of mind long after their loved ones have been laid to rest. And so they started asking questions there. And it was around that time that this new research from Richard Head on carbon majors came out. So joining the cause and effect dots, typhoon survivors and civil society began to push the questioning even further. If climate change is fueling extreme weather events, shouldn't the companies that contributed to it and provided and profited to most from climate pollution be held accountable? So there was a coalition of Filipino individuals and civil society who submitted a petition to their National Commission on Human Rights to conduct an investigation into the responsibility of major investor-owned fossil companies, including ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, Chevron, Total, BHP Billiton, you can imagine the list, that they're responsible to fueling the climate crisis and harming human rights of Filipinos. And they've held 12 hearings, that commission. There were 26 community witnesses. I know there's a lot of people here working directly with communities. Those community witnesses were very brave, I thought, and came forward. 52 experts testified in Manila and New York and London. We're awaiting the final resolution of the inquiry, but there were some remarks made actually at last year's COP by the commissioner Roberto Cadiz, and they're encouraging for the petitioners there. Remarks actually talk about findings that the companies in question played a clear role in anthropogenic climate change and its impacts, and that these companies could be found legally and morally liable, especially instances where they've engaged in acts of obstruction and willful obfuscation and fraud. So that's an example where you had a group of people come together in an organized way and use law and legal tactics to shift or seize power from the most toxic corporations. Another one that's now underway is in the Netherlands. Friends of the Earth Netherlands and co-plaintiffs and more than 17,000 citizens filed a case against Shell for its contribution to climate change, which violates its obligations under Dutch law and human rights law. And the plaintiffs are demanding that Shell has to reduce its CO2 emissions in line with the Paris Agreement's temperature goals, and are arguing that Shell's long-term knowledge of climate change and their misleading statements on climate and inadequate action to reduce emissions helps support a finding of Shell's unlawful endangerment of Dutch citizens. There's also some examples that are not, Greenpeace is involved in those too, but there's many people may know of the Peruvian farmer who sued a German energy company, RWE, which is one of the carbon major companies, demanding that RWE cover its share of the cost of protection against possible floods and mudslides in his village. And that he alleges that RWE knowingly contributed to climate change by emitting substantial volumes of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's been moved into evidentiary phase from a higher court in Hamm. And the court actually did recognize already that a private company could potentially be held liable for climate change and related damages. In the US, there's now over 20 US cities and counties. You mentioned Rhode Island, it's the state of Rhode Island and Delaware as well. They've launched lawsuits against fossil fuel companies to hold them financially responsible in their role of global warming related damages. And I think we're likely to see more and more coming forward against banks and pension funds. And even during the US presidential election, I thought this is kind of interesting. There's a number of Democratic candidates came out strong on what how they would hold the fossil fuel industry accountable. And during the race, now President Biden's plan included the establishment of an environmental and climate justice division within the US Department of Justice, which among other actions would, quote, strategically support ongoing plaintiff-driven climate litigation against polluters. So the US Department of Justice could, and in our view, I would say should, go even further and investigate fossil fuel companies deceiving the public about their role in causing the climate crisis. And if wrongdoing is established, seek to hold the companies accountable. I think now is definitely the time to start tackling climate fraud. Governments, just like corporations, are also on the hook, as we know. There's this incredibly exciting case to watch in France. There's a case where back 2 years ago, in March 2018, almost 3 years ago, Greenpeace France, working with others with Oxfam and Notre Affaire Tout, and others, filed the first ever climate lawsuit. And basically it targets the failure of the French state to address the climate crisis. President Macron may say big things, but what they're doing at home is completely inadequate. And it seeks for an administrative tribunal of Paris to order France to recognize the ecological harm caused by the government's climate inaction and to order the state to adopt measures to meet its international climate commitments. And on Thursday last week, basically the rapporteur public for the Paris Administrative Court declared that the state is at fault for not implementing measures to reduce its emissions and to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So the court is now set to issue a verdict in the coming days. And if it follows the rapporteur's conclusions, it would rule against France for its insufficient climate action. And this would be a historic step, I think, for the climate justice movement, and a significant step in forcing governments to reduce the emissions in line with 1.5. There's a lot more. There's climate litigation's really catching fire. There's a couple other, just quickly, there's one in Mexico, because I think each of these are quite different. And so for people listening to get, okay, like in Mexico, there's a coalition with Greenpeace and indigenous communities of the Yucatan Peninsula and people from Baja California Sur. They initiated 3 state-based lawsuits against the energy sector program in Mexico, and one more actually against national COVID-19 contingency energy policies, because they were promoting the use of fossil fuels while drastically limiting the transition to clean energy. And actually several judicial instances have since found that the promotion of fossil fuel use over renewable energy sources undermine the rights to a healthy environment. So we're waiting for the district courts to rule on this, on the state-based lawsuits, but the decisions that judges have made so far in the development of each case represent a victory for climate justice. The courts have sent a real clear message to the Mexican government that fossil fuel-based energy plans and laws have no place within Mexican constitutional regime. And the last one I just wanted to highlight, which you probably know better than I, which is one that happened in 2015 in Pakistan, where a farmer called Asghar Lagari won one of the world's first climate litigation climate cases, where he challenged his government's inaction and delay in implementing the national climate policy and framework, and that which seeks to steer Pakistan towards climate resilient development, and argued that the delays in addressing Pakistani people's vulnerabilities associated with climate change violated their fundamental, again, constitutional rights to life and to dignity. And the Lahore High Court Green Bench agreed with him in September 2015. So I think you see, you look back at these and you just kind of see how it's undeniable that the crises have had more extreme impacts on communities in the most vulnerable situations. And that when health crises or climate-induced crises strike, all of the social and systemic injustice that persist in our societies are multiplied or become even worse. And so I think this year, when that's all coming together, is really a key moment for change. And this growing constellation of legal decisions are helping make the case that new investments in fossil fuels, for example, are unlawful. So in closing, I just want to, remind everybody, everyone has a right to a safe and stable climate. Governments do not have unlimited discretion. They must take ambitious action to address the climate emergency and other crises like COVID-19, to protect human rights in the process and to preserve institutions for the people. And similarly, corporations behind the climate crisis will be held liable for its costs and forced to change business models to prevent further harm. And having talked to you about climate litigation now, you may ask, well, why does it matter? Well, I think it matters because it really empowers people to bring about justice for their families, for their communities, and for all of humanity. It also raises public awareness that climate change poses a threat to people's rights and all of those future generations. It can foster public discussion on the level of ambition or the lack thereof of states in regulating climate change, and also result in individual protection of human rights, as well as the improvement of climate policy at the national and international levels. It matters also because I think, our generation is the last generation that can take steps to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And so through legal mobilization, people and communities rise up and lead the way for upholding the moral and the historical responsibilities towards future generations. So that being said, we know the climate crisis has deep structural roots that cannot just simply be litigated away. This isn't some silver bullet that can do that. But I think, and it's important to, when you're thinking about this, to have litigation be developed and conducted as part of a broader plan, what you might kind of consider as a theory of change. But I think overall what's important to remember is that climate litigation is about more than obtaining a judgment. It's a larger process in which the law is just one tool towards the ultimate objective of lasting change. There's a vibrant climate justice movement, as you know, and I think this moment is toxifying fossil fuels, it's building community power, it's increasing people's sense of agency and contributing to a whole new mindset for systemic change from the grassroots. So I really invite everyone who is listening to join this movement, if you're not already part of it, to be part of a new system that defends and promotes public and planetary health. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that excellent tour de force of climate litigation. I have followed a little bit of it, but not in the detail that you've just presented. So that's good to know developments in that arena. I will interrogate a little bit about that, but before I do, I'd like to take you to our old stomping ground, which is the UNFCCC process, where we've been involved in the loss and damage negotiations. I've been advising the least developed countries group on that. Just recently, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh has taken over the leadership of the Climate Vulnerable Forum countries at the leadership level, and under her leadership, the Climate Vulnerable, and she'll be the chair for the next 2 years, which will include the upcoming COP. And under her leadership, Bangladesh has decided that they will be taking loss and damage as an issue for COP26. Now, given that we've had a welcome change in the United States with President Biden being elected, sworn in now, taking climate change seriously, appointing some very important and progressive people, particularly Secretary of State John Kerry, who was in Paris and negotiated the Paris Agreement under Obama. You will recall that in Paris, actually, when we negotiated Article 8 of the Paris Agreement on loss and damage, John Kerry was the one who insisted on inserting language that said in COP21 decision that this could not be used for compensation and liability. And we had to agree to that because otherwise he was not going to agree to anything. And he said basically, you know, when we were in private with him, he said that he had to do this to protect him from the Republican Party in the US. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to defend it. And so, but now the situation has changed completely. You know, there's no way that loss and damage can be ignored anymore and can be stopped. In Madrid, the developing countries asked for finance for loss and damage beyond insurance. Insurance is sort of like a comfort zone for the developed countries, particularly the Germans. But it has to go beyond insurance. I mean, poor people can't afford insurance. So this is something that will be pushed. So my question to you, given your very strong knowledge of this and particularly your contacts with the US incoming administration, is there a scope for having a more nuanced and genuine discussion about this issue instead of just being stopped? You know, it's been very, very hard to get even this issue talked about from the developed countries' perspective. Do you think there's an opportunity there? And if so, how can we pursue it?
Yeah, I do think there's an opportunity there. I think for all the reasons you noted, and I think that it's unavoidable. I mean,
Exactly.
It's just unavoidable because the impacts are hitting so hard and so fast. Even more so than when this was negotiated in Paris 5 years ago, right? So I think that there's, for a new US administration that's prioritizing climate change, there's no way around it. And I think bringing the science into the discussion again is quite important. I've been thinking a little bit just personally about how this could come about, because I think there's different linkages. So on the international level, it's clear we need to move forward with the loss and damage mechanism. We need to look again at compensation and liability. And one of the reasons why I wanted to walk through the science is because I think as the Biden administration, Biden-Harris, very important Harris in this one, administration starts to move forward, in looking at climate fraud, in looking at the responsibility and liability of the carbon majors in damages in the United States, for example, particularly on the low-income communities in the US, and the focus on environmental justice and racial justice in this administration's approach on climate. It is a natural thing then to be thinking, well, what does that mean on the international level, right? And well, what it means on the international level is loss and damage. So, you could look at starting with something that I think just in my mind, it's almost like a two-track piece. One is on the corporate side, right? Because I think that that's an area due to the research and the science and maybe even the politics you could pursue, and you could look at how they could be contributing when there are cases found where they would have to pay damages into the international fund. But also, I think the administration needs to be ready to look at it on a governmental level. Are they going to want to do that? No. Should they do that? Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much. And so let me just pursue this a little bit. One of the things that we are finding, we've done 6 days round the clock of these discussions around the world. And even though local adaptation is very context specific in a given country, in a given location, in a given, vulnerable, climate vulnerable conditions, whether flood or droughts or cyclones, nevertheless, there is actually a very strong global correlation that is almost universal, which you've just touched on, which is that in any given situation, whether it's a poor country or a rich country, the most vulnerable citizens are the poorest, and very often people of color, very often immigrants who happen to be living in the worst places, the most vulnerable places. That's a given. That when I talked about the Rhode Island, that's exactly what happens in the city of Providence. Right. Timmons Roberts, who's a professor at Brown, he said exactly that. He said, when we look at who the most vulnerable are. The homeless are, where the you know the houses are all cramped and poor conditions. They're all immigrants, local, you know. So this vulnerable population inside a single country is very true globally as well. And so there is an opportunity for solidarity. The climate justice issue
Yep.
is one that cuts across borders, where we can link up with your homeless and your citizens, and we can do it at our end, they can do it at their end, and we can link with each other globally now, is in ways that we didn't have before. As Greta Thunberg has shown, the school kids around the world are now one big united front, which has made
Yeah.
a big difference. Can we do that similarly with the victims, as it were, of the impacts of climate change and environment? It's a mix of environmental issues, local environmental issues, with climate change adding another dimension to it. But the case is very strong. The victims stand out.
Yep.
They are very clear who the victims are. And can we then use these litigation areas, opportunities in the different constituencies and different legal settings? And I know a group of lawyers in Bangladesh would be very interested to learn about examples where they might be able to
Yeah.
take our government to court for not, helping, and then through them to the big polluters. So that's sort of the argument that is being looked at here as
Mm.
well. So would you like to share some thoughts on that? What
Yeah,
we might be able to
absolutely.
do to link up? The question is, how can we link up more effectively globally amongst these vulnerable communities across the globe?
Oh, it's super interesting. I mean, because I was speaking to some of the youth leaders, right, from Fridays for Future, and I asked them recently, so how much do you work with vulnerable countries? Kind of and they said, well, we do work with some of the youth in those countries, right? And so, but I think that there's even a greater potential, not greater, but additional potential for the youth in different countries who are also vulnerable and are going to be living with this for some time, to be connected in with different countries. But I also, I've always thought that connecting the dots between these vulnerable communities would be immensely powerful. And I think it could be done, pretty well. This is the opportunity right now that it's opportunity and tragedy, but the reasons why people are vulnerable and the reasons why, is, as I was saying, it's like the system has so failed to take care of them. So where I see a number of different opportunities. So one is sure we could look and see, and I'd be happy to talk to, point anybody my way. I can connect them in with our legal team.
We'll do that.
And on that side of things, but also just thinking about the hierarchy of norms. So just stick with me for a minute, because if you think about our movements, you have movements on development that are focused about inequality and universal, for example, universal basic income. You have the whole vaccination debate that's happening right now, and the need for people's vaccine. You have the fact that healthcare is also in most countries, right? Is inequitable. And you have climate damages happening in the same way. So, and you can go on and on. So it is this moment where I feel like connecting across all those different movements into the values that connect us all and the change that we want to see can build power on the ground around specific fights that we need to win. But also, like the COP this year shouldn't only be about the detailed negotiations. It should be about whether heads of state understand that the people and the planet needs to take precedence over short-term economic profit. So I think that's the opportunity to link us up. And I think it happens quite a lot on the ground, but I think if we can do that now with, we can learn from youth, but also others on how to do that. But really direct it at certain things, making the COP about something much bigger, also the biodiversity COP, also the food summit, right? That's coming up. There's a whole number of things about creating a better world and what that looks like.
Absolutely. So incidentally, on the food summit, I've been roped into chairing the Action Track 5 on resilience there,
Aha,
which is an opportunity for us to again also
definitely.
link up. Great. Jennifer, thank you very much. We're coming towards the end. Let me end with one further question in your capacity as the head of Greenpeace. I don't know if you know this, but about 10 years ago, when I was still living in the UK, I was on the board of Greenpeace UK for several years. So I'm quite familiar with and fond of Greenpeace when Kumi Naidu was the head
Oh,
when he
great.
came in. And one of the things I tried to persuade Kumi, but I never did, but I'll ask you, Greenpeace never opened an office in Bangladesh. And why aren't you in Bangladesh? Have you ever thought about it?
We've thought about it, and actually we should talk, because I think we may be interested in pursuing something a bit more regional, like where there's offices in Bangladesh or in Nepal or we have an office in India. So I think it may have, without making any promises, but I think it's a good moment to talk again. I think, and I also want to say, even without a Greenpeace office, there's so much more that we could be doing together.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, let's keep that conversation. I'll come back to you on that.
Keep that conversation going. Exactly. So we are going to take a break in our conversation now, but we will follow up afterwards, definitely in the coming weeks and months, and definitely prior to COP26. I'd like to strategize a little bit more with you, particularly on the issue of loss and damage, how we might take that forward. So with that, let me thank you very much, Jennifer, for taking the time to be with us. We are recording this, and we'll be sharing the recording with you and others. Incidentally, what we find is that the recording gets quite a lot of people watching it in their own leisure time. And so we look forward to people seeing this. I know a lot of people working on loss and damage that I know would be very interested in hearing your state of the art in terms of where the litigation is. This is something that we aren't doing ourselves, but we following very keenly, because as you said, this is another arena in which this issue can be brought up in different ways and raise awareness of it as well at a minimum. Even if we don't win a case, at least we raise awareness.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Jennifer. Really
appreciate it. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.